Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, it's going to be a more political book because today I'm covering Returned. The subtitle is Going and Coming in an Age of Deportation. The back cover states that the cover design is by Sandy Drucker. The cover illustration is Chutes, Ladders y la Migra by Gabriela Munoz, and that the keywords for this, should it be sorted on a bookshelf, are anthropology, Latin American studies, and immigration. The author, Deborah A. Boehm, is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Women's Studies, Gender, Race, and Identity at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the author of Intimate Migrations, Gender, Family, and Illegality Among Transnational Mexicans. Now, that's what she was when this book was published back in 2016. So I don't know if she still is serving in that position at the University of Nevada. What I do want to emphasize is that her previous work focuses on transnational Mexicans, and that's what this book does too. It mostly follows the stories of several Mexicans that have been affected significantly by the border and crossing it illegally. I bought this book in El Paso. I got this book. I got this bookmark. It states on the back, join the El Paso Matters book club. At El Paso Matters, we're just as passionate about El Paso as you are. Our book club celebrates border culture and highlights great authors from the region. On that same date, I also purchased this book, In the Vortex of the Cyclone, selected poems from Exilia Saldana. I haven't read this book yet, but I do want to someday because it includes side-by-side translations. So one side, this side, has Spanish, and then this side has English. But I digress. What I love about Returned is multiple things, really. What always intrigues me when I pick up books off of the shelf, especially ones that are more essay-like, that would be read for a class or for a book club, is that this has underlinings, it has comments in the side. Here's a good example in chapter 1 titled Destinations. The underlined and asterisked section states, the categories assigned by the U.S. government are plentiful even as they limit or constrict identities. Deportable, illegal alien, criminal alien, permanent resident, citizen, non-citizen, naturalized citizen, and guest worker, among others. So, as always, I really appreciate a book that has clearly been owned and read and analyzed by someone before. But also, this is a pretty personal book. My maternal grandparents were immigrants from Mexico to the United States of America. And they did so during a time where it was less documented. I don't know exactly what year my grandparents came to the United States of America, but I do know that they did so in the 50s, and I don't know if it was because of the Bracero program or if it was just because the border was not as regulated at the time. But I do know that my maternal grandfather, came to the U.S. because his older brother had been working in the U.S. and sending money home, a time-honored tradition of doing that. You know, they do that in our generation, in Gen X, in the boomers. They've done it as long as that border has been open for migrant working. They've been doing that. So my maternal grandfather's older brother was sending money home, and then one month he just stopped sending money home. My grandfather was sent by the family to the United States to figure out why that money stopped. And after a while, he discovered his older brother working in, I think it was Hammond, Indiana, and the money stopped flowing because he had a wife and a kid. And they, that kid's now an American citizen because of birthright citizenship, and so he, to support his family, stopped sending the money home. My grandfather then continued to live in the area. He had now family that he could rely on and not just be alone, and he continued the tradition of sending money home to his family until he started a family of his own. It was something he really appreciated about his the steel mill he worked for, was that they paid for his GED. They helped him become a better citizen of the United States of America, and in return, he worked even harder because he appreciated his employers. And so what you get in this book is a lot of stories like that. People that are working for companies and they get deported, or they get found out and deported, or they fall in love, and when they want to file paperwork to get a green card or get permanent residency, they get told they have to go back to Mexico for the amount of time that they were living in the United States of America. And for some of these people, they've been here since they were 6 years old, and when they're 28 and trying to get married, they're told you have to go back to Mexico and live there for the duration of the amount of time you spent in the U.S. before you can come back. And that's an entirely new generation. And if they've got an American spouse, that's not doable, because then the couple is separated for over 2 decades. And so you get a lot of those stories in this book, and it's really a collection of case studies discussing the various ways in which people integrate to their nation and then get expelled from it, how a lot of children get caught up in the crossfire. And there's a few good case studies in this about like some high schoolers that, this being post 2008, they have iPhones and smartphones and are constantly online texting with their friends, and then the parents get deported, and so the family goes back to Mexico, and these children who don't know Mexico at all, they speak English as a second language, but Spanish in a very stilted and American way. They don't fit in with the Mexicans that they now are around. And so these families are disrupted by the forced movements. And you could argue on one hand that they shouldn't have been here in the first place, that they crossed illegally and thus their presence was a ticking time bomb. But this book makes a lot of appeals to emotion, and I think that's one thing that does need to be covered in this video, is that the appeal to emotion is very strong in this book, that these people come to America and they live here and they really integrate into the society, and mentioning all that is an attempt to appeal to the sympathy of Americans and to try and influence them, say, look at all these poor families, why don't you think about them? There's a couple case studies in here that do really irritate me though. There's one example of a Mexican immigrant who didn't even really cross that far into the United States. He lived and worked in Albuquerque for a landscaping company, and his employer, seeing his dedication to the work and actually improving his skills and being a leader among the employees of this company, even the ones that knew he was undocumented, and were American citizens looked up to him, and he was elevating himself within the company. He was being promoted to like a manager of different sites. And so eventually this undocumented immigrant was given a position as the manager in the Alamogordo and Las Cruces area. And that's where I live. And between Alamogordo and Las Cruces is a border patrol checkpoint. And the constant question every time you go through it is, are you an American citizen? But as it describes in this case study, he said no, but was still allowed to go over the border constantly. He was allowed to go past that checkpoint constantly because he was doing work. And while based in Las Cruces, he was doing a job in Alamogordo, and he complained to his employer, the owner of the business, that there was this one young man who didn't want to do work. He showed up late. He spent more time on break than actually working for the landscaping company. He would basically use the job as an easy paycheck without actually doing the work. But what this employee knew was that the manager was an undocumented immigrant. And rather than accept that this undocumented immigrant was worthy of being his manager, worthy of reporting his inadequacies to the owner of the business, the young man reported the manager to Border Patrol, and this manager of the landscaping company had to be deported back to Mexico. It doesn't say what happened to the young man that did that report after this whole deportation, but if the business owner was an intelligent man, he probably, and it sounded like he was just given the description of the case study, if he was an intelligent man, he would have fired that young man for his inadequacies. But that kind of behavior is really irritating because it shows kind of like an American laziness that we deserve more because I was born here. And this hard worker, despite all the good he does in the community, despite the hard, good work he does, because he's illegally here, I'd rather get rid of him than accept that I should improve myself as a person, as an employee, as a citizen. There's other case studies in here where there's a young man who was in a car that was pulled over. He grew up in Colorado. He and his friends were driving home after a party. The young man hadn't been drinking, but because he was here illegally, he was detained, deported, sent to his grandparents' home. His parents and immediate family were not deported, just he himself was deported. And so now this young man of 17 years old is stuck with his grandmother and living in a small town where he doesn't really fit in. And his siblings are married to American citizens or are American citizens themselves. And so they're not going to get deported. And he lives in isolation away from them. He can't even legally re-enter the United States to see them, even just for Christmas or to see his niece born. He can't do any of that. Their family is afraid of being permanently deported as well, so they can't visit him to show off that niece to her uncle. And so there's all these case studies, and yes, they are appeals to the sympathy, to the pity of Americans. Look at what this is doing to families. These are ordinary people trying to raise families and do so in a way that brings as little harm as possible to their kids. It does appeal in that way. It appeals to humanity. And that's what I love about this book. It is very academically written, but it's not entirely long. It's only 152 pages. Here's a good example. I think it's actually the one that I was just discussing about this young man in Colorado. It says, earlier I introduced Jamie, who was deported when he was a teenager. During Jamie's immigration hearing, the judge asked if he had any family members who were from the United States. Feeling hopeful, Jamie mentioned his two siblings who are U.S. citizens. No, the judge clarified. Do you have any immediate family members who are U.S. citizens? Jamie recounted being confused by this question. To his mind, of course his siblings were part of his immediate family. But the judge explained that by immediate family members he meant parents, children, or a spouse. Jamie was surprised by the speed of the process, and especially of this discussion of one's family, given the significance of family to him personally. The judge just reads you your rights, and then he asks, are you married to a citizen? No. Do you have any citizen kids? No. Are your parents citizens? I said no. Well then, said the judge, I can't do anything for you. You have to leave, and that's it. Jamie said that people who did have U.S. citizen family members, the right family members, were assigned another court date, and the people who did not, well, that's it. So that's one of those examples, and especially living in the border region, frontera as it's called, it is a common discussion because so many people cross the border to work in Las Cruces or to work in El Paso or to work in Santa Teresa or any of the other border cities. So many people cross the border to work there and then cross the border again at night to go home. And there's so many people that cross the border, whether legally or illegally, in this area. And they have to pass through very specific channels, whether it's from El Paso and then head east, or from El Paso up north through Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and everywhere else, or they head west, maybe they head through Tucson, maybe they head through Yuma. So many of these people are migrating so that they can have a safe and secure place to raise their kids. And it does discuss how some of these kids that their parents were deported, they got deported too, and then they go to school in Mexico and there's constant shootings because the gangs aren't controlled. These towns have ineffective policing and so can't control the gangs or hinder the gangs. And so these people who are used to America are sent to Mexico and then don't find themselves at home. And now they're in a liminal space between two countries because they're not quite Mexican and they're not quite American. And legally they are of one, but culturally and socially they are of the other. It's a very difficult situation to be in, and it's a very difficult issue to deal with. But I really loved this book because it enlightened me to a large extent about the personal sides of these issues. The overall issue of immigration and the condensed issues of separated families, green cards, and the citizenship process, of crossing the border safely, of finding safe houses, of finding support from community members, of uprooting yourself because another member of the community gets deported. There's so many various specifications that this book zooms in on and focuses. I have read Harvest of Empire. I have read other books that discuss the citizenship process and the way the U.S. and Latin America has interacted in the last couple centuries. But this book is fascinating. If you are willing to read such academic language, I encourage you to do so. Like I said, it's barely more than 150 pages, and it's all very engaging, very informative, and it's just a fascinating look at a very difficult subject. So, yeah, I liked this book. I don't remember how much I paid for it. There's a marking that says $4 as is. I don't think that's right, but if it is, I got my money's worth out of it. This book is easily worth more than $4. I really loved the book and reading it. So I think if this is the kind of subject you are interested in, you should look into this book and maybe others like it. It is a really, really good font of information. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.